Let's all have a Coke. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 15 of season 6, and we are continuing our series of episodes all about the world of cryptids, this time with the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek.
Whew, okay, we're going to try to make some sense of this movie that we watched, The Legend of Boggy Creek. I figure I'll give you some background to the film before we jump in. This film is based on a real cryptid. There was actually a Bigfoot-like monster that made local news in Fouke, Arkansas in 1971. Apparently, a couple saw it outside of the home, and then it was seen by a few others in the woods after that. So there were several sightings throughout 1971. And that spawned this movie that we watched today, The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is a faux documentary about the Fouke monster, or really what we would call Bigfoot. The movie came out in 1972. It was directed by Charles B. Pierce. He is well known in the horror community for his film that came out a few years after this, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which came out in 1976. Now, that film is also narrated by Vern Stierman, who did voiceover for this movie. He's the narrator that walks us through Fouke and introduces us to the people who have seen this creature. The Town That Dreaded Sundown is also based on real events, except this time it's a serial killer and a few murders that happened in and around the area of Texarkana, which is close to where Fouke is. This movie was made for $160,000, and Pierce hired locals to be in the film. He also did that with The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Now, I had some trouble finding really how much the movie made. It was made for $160,000, so it was a relatively low budget film. It became a cult classic over the years, but it was a hit with people even after it came out. Apparently, it became really big at local theaters where he would show it. So I found a number saying that it had made as much as $55,000 its first week, and that was a single theater that brought that in. Now that seems unrealistic to me, but that was what one of these articles was saying. Apparently, though, it was so popular that when it would show at these theaters, it would be kind of like a one weekend only type thing, and lines would stretch around the block. I did see it. People really enjoyed it, especially at drive-ins, which I can kind of see that because it has that feel to it. I can imagine being at a 70s drive-in and seeing this and it, as a double feature, monster movie type thing. So apparently that's part of what drove its kind of cult status as being a favorite film. But I did see a number that said in all it made $25 million. That really shocked me, but again, that's unverified. I couldn't really find exactly the numbers for that, but I did find that pretty interesting. Apparently, Pierce would joke that he was going to win an Oscar from this film, which, of course he did not. But it was, I think, ranked 11th highest grossing film of 1972. So it did pretty well. It did so well that it spawned 4 sequels. Not all of those were official sequels, and they didn't happen immediately. They kind of were stretched out. But a lot of people, like I said, it had kind of a cult status, and it did influence, for instance, the Blair Witch and those type of faux documentary style films, which we've talked about. His daughter, Pamela Pierce Barsalou, got the rights. I don't know where she had to get the rights from. I don't know if she had to buy them from somebody who owned them, but apparently she got the rights and was able to remaster the film in 2019. So the remastered version is out there and you can watch it. So that's kind of a really quick history of the Legend of Boggy Creek as far as the film itself. Again, it is based on a real cryptid, the Falk monster. And when I went to look up that, I did see that there were sightings of this creature even as late as like the 90s. It seemed to kind of like ebb and flow, I guess, as these things do, but there would be years where nobody really said they saw anything in the woods, and then suddenly one person would say they spotted something, and then 3, 4, 5 more people over the course of like a couple of years would say they saw it, and then it would kind of die down again. So it's kind of interesting, just kind of, I think, looking at that as like a regional cryptid. But this movie is something else. So I am really curious. We're going to talk about our experience watching the film and what we thought of it. Matt, Mel, give me your thoughts. I know you have them. What did you think about The Legend of Boggy Creek?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I'm still not sure what I watched, I think is the best way to describe my thoughts on this movie. It is a strange collection of half ideas, is kind of what it feels like. And it's done in this sort of documentary style, but like almost like one of those shows that would have been on like the Wide World of Disney way back in the day. It's even got the same sort of like voiceover kind of narration sort of thing, but at the same time it's not an actual documentary. It's obvious that these are actors, and it never treats itself as a documentary. I don't know. I'll say this: if I were not watching this for the podcast, or possibly with a group of friends, I probably would not have made it all the way through of my own volition. To put some context in, I recently watched, like last weekend, before recording this, watched the latest Batman movie, The Batman, the one with Robert Pattinson, the one that's 3 hours long. And that movie definitely feels every minute of 3 hours. It felt long. I mean, like a lot of 3 hour movies tend to do. But this movie is 1 hour and 26 minutes. I know because I actually looked. I paused it almost an hour in thinking, dear God, it has to have been like 2 hours, and it was only an hour. Like, I don't know how it did it, but like everything seems so slow and anticlimactic and uneventful that it just drags on. So even though it's barely even 90 minutes, it feels like a lifetime watching it. That's my thought. I don't know. There were no central characters aside from the narrator. It's kind of a collection of snapshots of different people's encounters with this Falk monster. I mean, we might as well just say Bigfoot, because that's essentially what they're playing it out to be. But yeah, I don't know. You could definitely tell that they were locals and not actors, because there was not a whole lot of acting talent in it. I could see watching this in a drive-in, though. I don't want to completely just destroy this movie. I could see this being a fun movie to watch with friends, maybe go into a drive-in, that sort of experience. So, I mean, I didn't outright hate the movie. I just found myself very bored throughout it and kind of waiting for something to happen, and it never quite did. I think that was kind of my overall take on it. And with that, I guess I'll let Mel jump in now.
Yeah, Matt, I definitely agree with your thoughts about how it's just kind of disjointed and episodic. This is my second time watching The Legend of Boggy Creek, so I'd known about this movie for a long time, but it was when we had, I think it was when Lisa and I interviewed Andy Davidson about his book, The Boatman's Daughter, and he mentioned The Legend of Boggy Creek and how I believe he had grown up kind of in this area, in this region, and knew of this cryptid and the movie, and was talking about how he had seen this when he was young. And I was like, I've heard of this movie. I'm going to watch it. So I watched it then. So this is my second time watching it. I definitely think it fits in this series. As you said, Lisa, as a regional cryptid, there were newspaper articles, there were people looking for it. Apparently, this was a big thing that people in this town would talk about. It's a very small town, so you could see how people would see this or maybe be influenced by people talking about it to see it. I want to say there was even something similar to the wild attack that I'm sure we'll talk about at some point at the end of the movie. Another thing I thought was interesting about it is, I had read in an article about it coming out and remastered that several of the people in the movie were themselves. So, yeah, I mean, they weren't necessarily actors. I think they were trying to go for a real feel. He actually interviewed people who had claimed to see the monster. And I jumped on IMDb, and apparently Willie E. Smith played Willie E. Smith. And I think all the Crabtrees but one were the actual Crabtrees. And then there were local people, playing some of the other folks. So I think you get a feel in some ways for maybe what it would be like for someone to come in and be talking to people about this. I think he attempted to give it some sort of narrative continuity by having the frame of supposedly child coming back to visit, but it definitely, I liked your description, Matt, of the wide world of Disney. It felt like those really old, 1950s or 60s, documentaries that would just be on TV when we were kids, and there would be a narrator talking and maybe some music, because there are some songs that I guess Charles Pierce wrote and performed in this movie as well. Because of the reenactments, there's a slight unsolved mystery feel, but it's this movie feels old to me, and it feels older than the 70s. I'm assuming the equipment was older, the feel was slightly older. It's definitely it just feels like an older Disney movie that you would see. I expected to see you kind of have the cutoffs to the nature and the animals and that sort of thing that we used to get too. I guess something I thought was really positive about the movie, I don't know that you can have a narrative if you're trying to make some sort of documentary. And so you're just telling people stories of encounters, but it does make it hard to watch. But I did think maybe I thought that the representation of the Boggy Creek or the swampy area was interesting. He definitely tries to let that be a character on its own and lets you I feel like by the end of the movie, you've got a real feel for the environment as it would have been at that time and the place where people would have been seeing this Bigfoot monster. And I guess that would be a strength of the movie. But it is a rough movie to watch because of the lack of narrative. I'm also not sure about what looks to be sometimes actual dead animals for the animals that the monster injures. That was disturbing to me. Of course, it's, I guess, the time period. But yeah, those are just some of my impressions. I totally see the disjointedness, but I did think it was interesting to get a feel for the region and the landscape and those sorts of aspects that might influence this particular cryptid. And I do think we can't really argue with the fact that this is this is a cryptid, even though the glimpses we see in the movie are not real, obviously. There's still people claim that there was something there. So yeah, those are some of my disjointed thoughts about the disjointed movie. I will say I've seen the MST3K take on the sequel that I'm pretty sure was Pierce's sequel, and if I was going to watch one of these again, I would watch the first one, The Legend of Boggy Creek, again. I will say that. So Lisa, what are some of your thoughts building on what Matt and I are saying? I feel like it's so hard to talk about this movie in a way that doesn't end up just as disjointed as the movie itself.
Oh yeah, there's going to be no continuity or any kind of narrative logic, I think, that follows this episode, because it's going to be really difficult. But you're right. This Boggy Creek 2, actually Boggy Creek 2 and The Legend Continues, is the only sequel that Pierce did himself. So all the other ones I think are inspired by Boggy Creek. And that one came out in 1983, the one that you were talking about. The Mystery Science Theater did the episode on. I don't know if I could watch that after watching this one. This one, there were okay. I agree with everything that y'all are saying. It definitely feels older than 1972. When I looked it up, this was his first film that he directed, so I do imagine that everything was just very low budget, probably with older cameras. That's probably what lended itself to the older feel of it. But it was the tone of this film was really disjointed in that sometimes you felt like you were watching, or at least I did, like an Andy Griffith episode of television. Like it was very Matt, again, the world of Disney feel of it all from like the 50s or 60s really kind of fits, because it just was kind of showing the town and you're meeting the townspeople. And there would even be this really like upbeat music behind it. And it was just kind of like, oh, okay, we're just traveling down the road and we're going to go talk to some old men sitting on a porch. And, the music that's playing is very much just kind of like, it's very just like, I don't know, like happy. And then all of a sudden it would be in one of those reenactments. And I think having those right next to each other made the reenactments feel very chaotic because it was such a tonal shift to it. And it wasn't like it was, the reenactments were really cheesy. I mean, you could tell that they weren't actors per se, but I think it was just because even a lot of those were at night and it was so much darker and it was so much like looking out into the woods and trying to figure out, like, do you see something? And when you did see the monster, it would be just like an arm going by or like a leg. That at times I almost expected it to get violent, and then it didn't. And it was strange because I feel like as a horror movie lover, I'm probably jaded to a lot of like what's scary. But there were moments in this where I thought, "Oh, this is going to get like really scary." Like but then it would pull away and you'd be back in the sunshine and you'd be back going down like the dirt road with like the happy music behind it. So that was a little confusing, but I can see how if you were watching this in like 72 when it came out, sitting outside in your car at a drive-in, that those moments could be very creepy. So yeah, it was strange. It was strange and disjointed. One thing I did like about it, well, there were a couple of things that I did think when I was watching it, and it really has nothing to do with the experience of watching the film. I think if I had watched it as a child, it would have really scared me. But two things. First, I think it's fascinating to watch this film as like a relic of film history, because in the development of like this kind of faux documentary, like aiming for the realism of a horror movie, I find it really fascinating to watch this and be like, okay, this was one of the really the first ones that attempted to do that, and that's really fascinating. Also, you can tell where we are in film history based on like what techniques they're using. Like the voice narrator and all that. That was fascinating. And then also as fans, Mel, you mentioned it, of Andy Davidson's The Boatman's Daughter. I really enjoyed watching this because you could see how much this film influenced that book, from like the characters' names to some of the river shots to like one of the cabins that was up on the stilts. I really enjoyed that. Just from that, again, it's kind of like looking at it as a piece of horror history. That being said, I did not enjoy the film. that much. I mean, I don't know if I would want to sit down and watch it again. Maybe with a big group of friends, but um, I enjoyed it from that film history point of view.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying, and I think you're right that it is like this moment kind of to look at, especially also maybe in this idea, like you were saying, of the documentary aspect of it too. I feel like the strengths of it, besides like trying to root us in a place, the strengths of it to me, even though it still feels old and dated, and it doesn't give it a narrative, is when they talk to people, when they have the moments where people are literally giving their own interactions with it, or I'm assuming reading someone else's, the documentary feel, where I feel like we're going into this town of 350 people and asking them what's going on and getting the mosaic of perspectives about what it could be. The things that would knock me out of that and start to make it tedious was when the songs would happen that were about the people or the monster, because I felt like it was like a weird break where like you could just cut that and keep the kernels of information that we were getting about the Falk monster. It wouldn't give it, connectiveness or connective tissue, but you could at least say this is a person who is letting us hear local people who either experienced it or are reading accounts of this, and then you can put it all together to try to figure out the monster. I felt like the jumping back and forth between people telling what the monster did to these like breaks in the story for us to visit with people that weren't really connected to the monster. The man out in the swamp who liked his privacy was interesting, I suppose, as a character, but he didn't even believe in the monster, so we didn't learn anything from him. So I would have liked to focus maybe more on the documentary parts and a little less on the Disney type moments that just let us sit like looking at something or listening to something that wasn't necessarily related to the thesis of the movie, whatever that was. And then some of the reenactments maybe needed to be tightened up a little bit. I do think, as you were saying, Lisa, just really quickly, because I know you want to react to what I just said, that there's a lot of threat in the movie, but yeah, it stops short of maybe being like really horrifying. There are some moments where I'm like, whoa, like when that guy described it killing his dog, that's disturbing. I wish I never heard that kind of, but like you have to use your imagination. There's only like one or two moments in the dark where the monster attacks an animal or a person. And it definitely relies on insinuating what could happen. But for the most part, the monster really just seemed to be chilling and like watching people. It wasn't really like they had to really ramp it up to like make it seem like it was quote unquote rampaging. And I wish that it had picked one. Are you either a horror movie or are you a documentary about an interesting cryptid?
Yes. And I'm really glad that you said that, because I think you articulated some of the things I was thinking really well, especially with going back and forth made it feel really disjointed. I almost wish it had kind of started off more documentary style, where we were getting, we were learning about it. Well, kind of like the other Bigfoot movie we watched. I mean, of course, that was a recent one. What was it, Willow Creek? Is that the name of it?
Yeah, Willow Creek.
Where it kind of starts out, you're getting to know the legend, you're getting to know some of the people, and then you're in the woods and it's terrifying. Things start happening. I think if it had stayed there, I would have enjoyed it more. One thing this is where my brain was going the whole time, and I didn't have a chance to rewatch this film. I've seen it a million times. But one thing I kept comparing it to, and this is probably going to sound a little like just out from left field, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like the original one that came out in 1974, because that's another one of these films that was done really low budget. I think, well, I mean, it probably had like double the budget of this film, but it was done really low budget. And of course, it was done with actors, and it does have like a narrative that you're following, but it's presented as like a true story. And I don't know, there were just parts in the woods, and especially when we were in the house with the people who were hearing it outside, and kind of the panic. Like there were moments of that where I kept thinking of moments in Texas Chainsaw. Um, and I like I'm putting this together in real time, like as we're talking right now. So I'm probably going to think about this more later, but I would love to kind of look at that. Again, it's kind of the whole film history of it and how this particular type of like horror movie has evolved. But it's fascinating to me to think that like what Toby Hooper did just 2 years after this film pushed the horror film so much further. But I definitely can see comparisons between the two. Just this like remote southern landscape and this push towards realism and I mean, Texas Chainsaw is a terrifying movie, but it also leaves a lot to the imagination in the same way that this film does. I mean, it stays in the terror longer and it lingers there and it does show you more, but it still relies on that like imagination aspect of it more so than I think people realize, because people often think of that as a really gory movie, and really it's not terribly. I don't know. I'd be really interested to know if I'm the only one making that comparison, because maybe I've lost my mind.
That's a really interesting comparison. I found myself when the two couples showed up at the house that they were going to rent, thinking of Evil Dead. I know it's like a completely different movie, but the swampy scenes, lingering on the scenery, the people going into an isolated house and dealing with the creepiness of nature. Obviously, it goes in a way different direction, but the whole beginning of that movie was kind of like the two couples going to the house to get attacked by the Falk monster to a certain extent.
I disagree.
I'm not saying it's a straight up comparison. I just found echoes of it a little bit.
I can see what you're both saying. I can definitely see. I can see shades of Evil Dead in that scene you were describing, Mel. And I guess as far as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the only part I could really see would be one of those scenes towards the very end where the monster's trying to break in when the girls are there. But to me, I mean, I guess the big difference is that those movies were interesting. I mean, I could see some stylistic comparisons that you could make, but like I don't remember which one of you said it. I think it was you, Mel, that the Evil Dead or Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of lean into the horror. I didn't really feel the horror at all in this movie. Like you said, Lisa, it's like it approaches something that could be scary, but never even crosses that line into scary or even getting there, really. And so I don't know. For me, it feels like a stretch, other than to say that there are similar echoes. But that's my opinion.
Well, I mean, to be clear, I do not think that they're in the same league at all. Texas Chainsaw is one of my favorite movies, and Boggy Creek is not. But I do see. I do think that they were trying to lean into the horror a little bit. Like I'm thinking in particular of the cat. Like that was the moment, even though it's kind of laughable looking back, that was one of the moments in the film where I thought, oh, they're really gonna like do something. And I kind of started feeling a little worried was when they lost the cat. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's gonna eat the cat, like it's gonna eat the cat. But then the cat just, I guess, died from fright because it wasn't like a mangled cat. But
that was obviously some cat that they had borrowed from a taxidermist.
It was an obvious stuffed cat, but also like, but when she was talking about like losing the cat and the cat being gone, and it's like, you know, you're in an isolated place in the woods and it's dark and there's something outside and then you can't find your pet. Like that part was where it really kind of inched toward, oh, this is playing up kind of the thriller aspect of it. Like that felt heightened to me in a way that the rest of the film didn't. I don't know. I think maybe just the way it was shot, that it kind of, that's where I'm pulling some of the the
I'll
Texas
agree with you
Chainsaw
on the.
Cross.
I agree
Yeah.
with you about the cat part. That was definitely one of the moments where it got really close to horror. And sorry, Mel, that's all I wanted to say. I don't want to step on what you're trying to say.
Oh, no, you're fine. I'm not sure that Pierce was trying to go for horror, really. I think Pierce was trying to do a documentary about this cryptid. I mean, one of his songs about it has like sympathy for it being lonely and like isolated, wondering why it's the last of its kind. I mean, I do think there are moments. I think the part where it tiptoes close to a horror line is like the part that you were talking about, Lisa, and then the end when the people are under siege in the house or whatever. But even then, like because of the low budget, they can't. I mean, it was creepy. I mean, when they find out there's a panther living under their house, that's scary. I don't want a panther under my house. But horror, I'm not so sure. But I don't know if Pierce was going for horror. I think if he was going for horror, he would have knocked out all the documentary parts and the lighthearted songs that you're pointing out, Lisa. I mean, I know we're a horror podcast, but I think it's more interesting to look at this as a cryptid documentary with some issues that maybe influenced people further on. I mean, the people working on Blair Witch said it was an influence on them, but they're very different movies. So I feel like we can only look at brushstrokes as connecting it to other movies because I'm not sure that he was necessarily going for horror. I don't know. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I'm glad he wasn't going for horror because he didn't get it. No, I'm sorry.
Maybe
No,
he was. I don't want to like do author intent, but the movie seemed more like he was going for a documentary with some scary moments.
I think you're right. I think you're right in pointing that out. Yeah, it really, looking at it through that lens as being more of the intention of documenting this monster that, like Lisa said in the very beginning of the episode with the kind of background on it, was actually cited, supposedly. But I'll believe that people think they saw it. So I mean, yeah, I think you're right that he wasn't intending for this to be a full-on horror movie at like Evil Dead or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or even Blair Witch we're going for. So I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, but then what was he going for?
Well, I've already admitted that I think it's a confused mix of tones.
He was going for the wide world of Disney meets Bigfoot.
Okay. Small town, regional, like wide world of Disney.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've seen it described as like we've been calling it a faux documentary. I think people have been like, I see it most often called a docudrama or a documentary style drama, which I think would fit it more. It's obviously going to have some like thrilling or quote unquote scary moments because it deals with a monster in the woods, like that it's going to have that. But I guess it was more meant to be a documentary drama. So I think that's why he was spending so much time with the people of Falk and like focusing on them and kind of trying to, I mean, almost like a slice of life, like capturing a specific place at a specific moment in time that just happened to be that there was like a monster in the woods at the same time, which I mean, that's kind of cool too when you look at it that way.
It feels to me like a really early a stab at like what we now think of as like what we watched like unsolved mysteries or City Confidential or something. Like we're going to this place where this weird thing is happening, and you talk to people, and you have reenactments, and by dint of what you're talking about, is something's going to be creepy or maybe scary, but the point is, let's look at this sleepy little town where this crazy thing happened, or let's look at this mystery that no one was able to solve. I feel like it was like an early kind of version of that. Now I don't know the history of those types of television shows, but that was like I get this like really kind of small town unsolved mysteries feel.
I mean, I can definitely see how this would feel like an unsolved mystery, especially some of those really early episodes when with the reenactments, and then those weren't always meant to be scary. I mean, I remember watching them when I would come home from school and being scared by a lot of the unsolved mysteries, but they weren't really meant to be, I think, that way. So I can see how that would fit with this kind of genre, where it's a little bit more of just here's this town and here's this mystery that's happening there. I still maintain that there's some connection between this and Texas Chainsaw. I don't know. I think it's the reach towards realism and kind of that gritty, almost like I mean, you're out in the wilderness, and I don't know, I still see something. And maybe I'm just leaning on that because his film that came out in 76, the town that dreaded sundown, definitely was made to be like a horror movie. I mean, it was made to be like a horror thriller movie. So I don't know, maybe that's where I'm leaning into, but maybe I'm the only one who thinks that. Well, I guess that's about as far as we're going to get with Boggy Creek. I don't know if I can say go out and watch this film. Listeners, if you're curious, go ahead and watch it. Or if you've seen it before, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I would especially love to hear if anybody agrees with me, but but that's just me. And of course, we also want to again recommend Andy Davidson's book, The Boatman's Daughter, because these two do share kind of a lineage. So that is a really great book. If that is something that you think you would enjoy, we all loved it. We all highly recommend it. All right. Well, I think that's it for today. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.